The telegram arrived on a Tuesday, which was the same day Helen Winslow buried the last of her illusions about the life she had been promised. She stood on the wooden platform of the Santa Fe Railway Depot in Dodge City, Kansas, in the summer of 1882, her single leather traveling trunk at her feet and a crumpled piece of paper in her gloved hand. The paper was the telegram she had received 3 weeks prior in Cincinnati, the one that had set her on this westward journey in the first place. It had been sent by a man named Robert Calloway, a land speculator she had met once at a church social back home, a man with bright eyes and a silver tongue who had described the New Mexico territory as if it were Eden itself. He had written to her with an offer that had seemed, at the time, like a lifeline thrown to a drowning woman. Helen had been drowning. There was no question about that. At 26 years old, she had recently lost her father to a fever, her mother having passed years before, and the small dress shop she had inherited had folded under a mountain of debt that her father had never bothered to mention. The house was sold. The shop was sold. Her cousin Margaret had taken her in with a thinly veiled charity that had felt more like slow suffocation. And then Robert Calloway's telegram had arrived, offering her a position as a seamstress and bookkeeper on his newly established homestead outside a small settlement called Redemption, in the territory of New Mexico. He had written that he needed someone capable and trustworthy, that the pay would be fair, the work honorable, and the territory full of opportunity for a woman willing to work hard. He had even paid for her train fare in advance, which should have struck her as odd but instead struck her as merciful. She had packed everything she owned into one trunk and she had come. She had come all this way, nearly 2,000 miles, and now she stood on the platform of the Dodge City Depot reading a second telegram, this one handed to her by the station agent as soon as she stepped off the train. It was brief and brutal in the way that official communications always were. Robert Calloway had been thrown from his horse 6 days ago, somewhere on the road between Redemption and the neighboring town of Cuivo Springs. He had died before sunset the same day. His estate, such as it was in the hands of his business partner, a man named Jacob Hartwell. Helen read the telegram 3 times. Then she folded it carefully and put it in her coat pocket beside the first one, and stood very still for a long moment while the world went about its noisy business around her. A family of settlers were loading a wagon nearby. A cattle drover was arguing with the station agent about the price of freight. A dog was barking somewhere behind the livery stable. The sun was enormous and white, and the dust was everywhere in her hair, on her lips, coating the back of her throat. She had no money to go back. She had no home to go back to. She had spent the last of her personal savings on the coat she was wearing and the gloves that were now beginning to stick to her hands in the heat. She had Robert Calloway's original telegram, the one with the invitation, and she had the name of the place he had meant to take her. Redemption, New Mexico territory. She picked up her trunk. She was not a woman who spent long hours feeling sorry for herself. It was a luxury she had never been able to afford, and she was not about to start now. She walked to the station agent's window and asked, in her most composed voice, how a person might make their way from Dodge City, Kansas, to Redemption, New Mexico territory. The agent, a thin man with enormous side whiskers and spectacles perched at the end of his nose, told her she could take the Santa Fe line south to Las Vegas, New Mexico, and from there hire a coach or a wagon driver to take her the remaining distance west to the settlement of Redemption, which was not large enough to have its own rail stop. She thanked him, spent the last of her traveling money on the southward ticket, and sat in the waiting room for 4 hours with her trunk beside her and her hands folded in her lap, planning what she would say when she arrived. The train to Las Vegas, New Mexico, was slower and hotter than the one she had already endured, and the seats were harder. Helen sat in the women's car and watched the landscape transform around her, the flat green grasslands of Kansas giving way to something harder and more beautiful, the land turning red and gold and enormous, the sky becoming a thing of almost shocking scale. She had grown up in Cincinnati, a city of modest hills and reliable green, and nothing had prepared her for the sheer size of the western sky. It pressed down on everything like a warm hand, and she found, despite herself, that she could breathe a little easier under it. She arrived in Las Vegas, New Mexico, in the early evening of the following day, and spent a sleepless night in a boarding house that smelled of lye soap and old wood smoke. In the morning she inquired about transportation west and was directed to a freight hauler named Tom Briggs, who made the run to Redemption twice a month. Tom Briggs was a red-faced man in his 50s who smelled of tobacco and horse, and who did not say much beyond the agreed-upon fare, which Helen paid by selling one of the 2 silver brooches she had inherited from her mother. She tucked the remaining brooch deep in her trunk and climbed up to the bench seat beside Tom Briggs, and they rode west into the territory. It was 2 days of traveling through country that Helen could only describe as magnificent and merciless in equal measure. The land was all red rock and juniper and sage, the mountains in the distance blue and white-capped, the road not much more than 2 ruts pressed into the earth by the repeated passage of wheels. Tom Briggs spoke perhaps a dozen words total during the journey. He was not unfriendly, just economical. He shared his traveling food with her, and he made sure she had enough water. And on the second evening, as the sun was dropping behind the mountains ahead of them in a fire of orange and red, he pointed to a cluster of low buildings in the valley below and said that there is redemption. It was smaller than she had imagined. There was a main street of perhaps a dozen buildings, a general store, a saloon, a livery, a small church, a sheriff's office, and a scattering of other establishments. There were maybe 2 dozen houses set back from the main street, some of them adobe, some of them timber, some of them what appeared to be a combination of the 2. Beyond the town, the land spread out in all directions, the homesteads and small farms and cattle operations that kept the settlement alive. Tom Briggs deposited her in front of the general store and drove on without ceremony. Helen stood in the street with her trunk beside her and looked at the town, and the town looked back at her, or at least the 2 men sitting on the porch of the general store did. One of them was elderly with a long white beard. The other was perhaps 40, with a sun-creased face and a deputy's star on his chest. She addressed the deputy. "I am looking for a man named Jacob Hartwell. I understand he was a business partner of Robert Calloway." The 2 men on the porch exchanged a glance. The elderly one's expression shifted into something that might have been sympathy. The deputy stood up slowly and removed his hat. "You must be the woman from Cincinnati," he said. "Word came ahead of you by wire. I'm Deputy Marsh. Mr. Hartwell's place is about 4 miles east of town. He asked us to let him know when you arrived." He paused and looked at her steadily. "Ma'am, I'm real sorry about Mr. Calloway." He was a man who talked big, but he meant well enough. "Thank you, Deputy," Helen said. "I would be grateful for any help in reaching Mr. Hartwell." Deputy Marsh sent a boy on horseback to carry word, and arranged for Helen to wait in the general store, where the proprietress, a sturdy woman named Agnes Fowler, gave her a cup of coffee and a chair near the window and regarded her with open curiosity. "You came all the way from Ohio on Robert Calloway's word," Agnes said. It was not quite a question. "I did," Helen said. Agnes made a sound that was not quite disapproval and not quite admiration. "That man could talk the birds out of the trees," she said. "Lord rest him." She refilled Helen's cup. "Jacob Hartwell is a better man, quieter but better." Helen did not know what to do with that information, so she filed it away and drank her coffee and watched the street through the window and tried not to think about how thoroughly she was dependent on the goodwill of a man she had never met. Jacob Hartwell arrived an hour and a half later. She heard his horse before she saw him, a steady, purposeful sound in the street outside, and then the door of the general store opened and he came inside, and she understood immediately what Agnes Fowler had meant by quieter. He was a man who did not take up space in a noisy way. He was tall, with wide shoulders and a lean build, wearing a plain linen shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbows and canvas work trousers tucked into worn boots. His hat was pulled off as he came through the door, and the hand that held it was calloused in the particular way that came from real work. He was perhaps 30, though the sun had added a few years to his face that she guessed he had not actually lived, with dark hair that needed cutting and eyes that were a deep and steady gray. He looked at her directly, and without any of the calculating assessment she had been bracing herself for. He simply looked at her the way a man looks at something he intends to take seriously. "Miss Winslow," he said, his voice was low and even. "I'm Jacob Hartwell. I'm sorry you came all this way to difficult news." "Mr. Hartwell," she said, rising and extending her hand. "Thank you for coming." He shook her hand with the automatic courtesy of a man who had been raised to it but who also, she sensed, genuinely meant it. He sat down in the chair across the small table from her and turned his hat in his hands once and then set it on his knee. "I expect you have questions," he said. "I have quite a few," she agreed. "Go ahead, then." She appreciated the directness enormously. She had spent too many years navigating the elaborate indirections of Cincinnati social life, where nothing was ever said plainly and everything required interpretation. She straightened her spine and asked the most important question first. "I have no money to return east and no employment waiting for me there in any case." Mr. Calloway's telegram described a specific position on a specific homestead. "I understand that homestead now belongs to you as his surviving partner. I am not asking you to honor an obligation you did not personally make. I am asking whether there is any legitimate work available to me in this settlement, and whether you have any knowledge of respectable accommodations." Jacob Hartwell looked at her for a long moment. A small line appeared between his brows, not displeasure, more like concentration. "Calloway and I had a partnership on the land and the cattle," he said. "He put in money and I put in work. His share of the enterprise reverts to his family in Missouri, but the homestead itself was always mine. The house, the land, the operation." He paused. "He told me about you. Wrote me a letter about 3 weeks back saying he'd invited you out to take charge of the household accounts and some of the record keeping. Said you were capable and needed a fair chance." Helen waited. "The invitation still stands," Jacob said. She had been prepared for many things. She had rehearsed arguments, anticipated objections, prepared herself for rejection and the need to pivot to other options. She had not quite prepared herself for a quiet yes delivered without drama or negotiation. "I want to be clear," she said carefully, "about the nature of the arrangement." "So do I," he said, and there was nothing in his voice but plain seriousness. "There's a room in the house that's been empty since my sister moved to Santa Fe last year. The position is for a housekeeper and bookkeeper, the same as Calloway described to you. I pay fair wages. The work is honest. If the arrangement doesn't suit either of us after a trial period, I will personally fund your return to wherever you wish to go." He said it the way he said everything, plainly and without excessive ceremony. "It's a long way to come for nothing. I'd rather you got something out of it." Helen looked at him steadily. She was a good reader of people. She had always been, and everything she could read in Jacob Hartwell suggested a man of his word. He was not warm in the way that Robert Calloway had been warm. He did not radiate charm or fill a room with easy talk. But there was a bedrock quality to him, a solidity that she recognized and trusted more than charm. "Then I accept," she said. "Thank you, Mr. Hartwell." "Jacob," he said. "Out here it generally saves time." "Helen," she replied, and that simply enough was how it began. The Hartwell homestead was 4 miles east of Redemption, set in a shallow valley where a reliable creek ran clear even in the dry months of summer. The house was larger than she had expected, built in the adobe style of the region with thick walls that kept the heat out and a covered porch that ran along the front and side. There were 2 barns, a vegetable garden that was clearly in need of attention, a cookhouse connected to the main building by a short roofed walkway, and a bunkhouse some distance away where Jacob's 2 ranch hands, brothers named Diego and Arturo Vega, lived. There were cattle on the land, a modest herd and horses, and the whole enterprise had the feel of something that was working, but that was being managed by one person doing the work of three. Helen's room was clean and spare, with a good bed and a window that looked east toward the mountains, and she lay in it that first night and listened to the enormous silence of the territory and felt something unknot itself in her chest. The silence was not empty. It was full of crickets and the distant complaint of a coyote and the soft breathing of a living landscape, and she found it more comforting than she had any reason to expect. She was up before sunrise the next morning. She had not been brought to the territory to be idle, and she had no intention of starting that way. She found the household accounts in a leather-bound ledger on a shelf in the main room and spent the first 2 hours of the morning going through them. They were not badly kept. Jacob had a methodical mind and had kept records consistently, but there were inefficiencies in the purchasing arrangements, and some of the cattle records needed reorganization, and she could see places where money was leaking quietly out of the operation that a better system would stop. She made notes in her neat, small hand, and then she went to work on the kitchen, which had clearly not been managed by someone who knew what they were doing in some time. She found what stores there were, assessed what was needed, and began to make the kind of order out of chaos that had always satisfied her on a deep level. Jacob came in from the morning's early work just as she was finishing a proper breakfast, eggs from the 3 hens she had discovered behind the cookhouse and cornbread made from meal she had found in the bottom of the store cabinet. He stopped in the doorway and looked at the table, and then at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "You didn't have to do all this," he said. "I was told the position included household management," she said. "This qualifies." He sat down and ate, and the silence between them was companionable rather than awkward, which she noted. After breakfast, she showed him her notes on the ledger. He leaned over the table beside her and looked at what she had written, and she was acutely aware of his proximity, the warmth of him, the clean smell of horses and work. He was quiet for a moment, reading through her observations. "You're right about the feed supply arrangement," he said. "Briggs charges more than the operation in Q of O Springs would. I kept using him because it was simpler, but it's costing me." A letter to the Q of O Springs supplier and a new standing arrangement would save you approximately $40 a year, she said, possibly more. He looked at her with something that was not quite surprise but was adjacent to it. "Where did you learn to read accounts like this?" "My father's shop," she said. "I kept the books from the time I was 16. He was a fine craftsman but a poor accountant." She paused. "The debt I discovered after he died proved that." Jacob was quiet for a moment. "I'm sorry about your father," he said. "Thank you." She appreciated that he didn't press further. The days settled into a rhythm. Helen managed the house and the accounts and the supply ordering with an efficiency that visibly relieved a burden that Jacob had been carrying without complaint. He was out from before sunrise until well after dark most days, working the cattle and the land with the Vega brothers, and when he came in at the end of the day he was tired in a clean, uncomplicated way. He was not a man who brought his exhaustion in like a grievance. He ate what was put in front of him, said what needed saying, and went to bed. On the occasional evening, when work did not consume every minute, he would sit on the porch after supper and read, or sometimes just sit, watching the stars come out over the mountains. Helen began to join him on those evenings. She told herself it was simply that the porch was the most comfortable place in the house once the day's heat had broken, and the stars in the New Mexico sky were so extraordinary that it would have been a kind of waste not to look at them. And both of these things were true. But it was also true that she found herself looking forward to those quiet hours in a way that had nothing to do with the stars or the temperature. Jacob was not a man who talked for the sake of talking. When he spoke, it was because he had something to say. She learned things about him in those evenings not through sustained conversation, but through the accumulation of small, careful pieces. He was originally from Missouri, the same state Robert Calloway had come from, and they had been friends since boyhood. He had come west at 22 because the land in Missouri had been too expensive and too crowded for what he wanted to build. He had spent 3 years working other men's cattle before saving enough to start his own operation. He had a sister named Clara who had married a lawyer in Santa Fe and was, by all accounts, extremely happy. He had never married, not because he was opposed to the idea, but because, as he put it one evening with the careful plainness that was so characteristic of him, he had not yet met a woman he felt he could invite into the life he was trying to build without doing her a disservice. Helen turned that statement over in her mind for several days after he said it. The town of Redemption was small enough that a single new arrival was an event, and Helen found herself the subject of considerable attention when she made her weekly trips for supplies. The women of the town were curious about her in the way that isolated communities are curious about newcomers, not unkind mostly, but assessing. Agnes Fowler at the general store became something of an ally and friend, a woman of good sense and broad charity who was interested in Helen as a person rather than as a subject of speculation. One afternoon, about 3 weeks into Helen's time in Redemption, Agnes leaned on the counter while Helen was sorting through a delivery of dry goods and said, without preamble, "You know that half the town thinks you've come to marry Jacob Hartwell." Helen kept sorting. "I've come to keep his accounts in order," she said, which, from the state they were in, badly needed doing. Agnes snorted. "That's not a denial. It's an accurate statement of the arrangement," Helen said. Agnes looked at her with the expression of a woman who had been observing human nature for 60 years and was not easily redirected. "He's a good man," she said. "Better than most. He helped the Vasquez family last winter when their roof came down in a snowstorm and never said a word about it to anyone. I only know because Maria Vasquez told me." Helen did not say anything, but she tucked that piece of information away with the others she had been collecting. The complication arrived in the form of a man named Preston Whitmore, and he arrived on a horse that cost more than most men in the territory earned in a year. Whitmore was from back east originally, Boston or Philadelphia, someplace with that particular accent and that particular brand of confidence that came from money and the expectation that money would always smooth the way. He had come to the territory 3 years ago and had steadily expanded his cattle operation to the point where he now controlled most of the best grazing land in the valley, which he had accomplished through a combination of purchasing, legal maneuvering, and what everyone in Redemption knew but could not prove was occasional intimidation. He rode onto the Hartwell homestead one afternoon in early September when Jacob was in town and Helen was in the garden, attempting to rescue the tomatoes from their drought-induced despair. She heard the horse before she saw the man, and she straightened and shaded her eyes and watched him come. Preston Whitmore was perhaps 45, with a well-tended mustache and the kind of groomed appearance that looked slightly wrong against the landscape, like something imported from another world. He dismounted with practiced ease and removed his hat and smiled at her with a smile that was very polished and said absolutely nothing real. "Miss Winslow," he said, "I've heard about you." "I'm Preston Whitmore." "Mr. Whitmore," she said, keeping her tone pleasant and neutral. "Mr. Hartwell is in town this afternoon." "It was you I came to see, actually," Whitmore said, and the smile stayed in place but his eyes were doing something calculating behind it. "I wanted to welcome you to the territory personally. We don't get many women of your evident quality out here." Helen had grown up navigating the social waters of a merchant family in a mid-sized city, and she had encountered enough men like Whitmore to recognize the particular texture of what he was doing. It was not exactly flirtation, and it was not exactly threatening. It was something else, a kind of establishment of territory, a first conversation in what he intended to be a longer negotiation. "That's very kind," she said, neither encouraging nor discouraging. "I also wanted to say," he continued, "that Hartwell's operation is modest. A woman of your capabilities might find broader horizons interesting." He let that sit in the air a moment. My own household is managed by a foreman and two hands, and it runs at about the efficiency you'd expect when there's no one at home who knows what a proper account book looks like. I'd be prepared to offer a very generous arrangement." Helen looked at him steadily. "I have an arrangement I'm satisfied with, thank you." Whitmore nodded as if this were exactly what he had expected and not at all a problem. "Of course. Well, the offer stands." He put his hat back on. "You'll come to my fall gathering at the end of the month, I hope. Everyone in the valley attends. I'd be glad to introduce you around." He rode out before she could respond, which she suspected was deliberate. She mentioned the visit to Jacob that evening on the porch. She told him plainly what Whitmore had said, including the offer of employment. She was not a woman who dealt in half-truths or edited conversations. Jacob's jaw tightened when she described the visit just slightly, and he looked out at the darkening landscape for a moment before he spoke. "Whitmore's been trying to expand his operation into this valley for 2 years," he said. "He wants my water access. This creek is the most reliable source in a 10-mile radius." He turned to look at her. "He wasn't coming out here to offer you employment. He was coming to find out what my situation is and whether there's a way to use it." Helen nodded slowly. "I thought it might be something like that." "Did it bother you?" Jacob asked. "Him coming out here while I was away?" "Not particularly," she said honestly. "Men like Whitmore are a known quantity to me." She paused. "Though I'll say his horse is extraordinary and he's wasted entirely on that man." Jacob looked at her for a moment and then, unexpectedly, laughed. It was not something she had heard from him before, a real, unguarded laugh, and it transformed his face so thoroughly that she felt something move in her chest like a door opening. "The horse's name is Theodore," he said. "He used to belong to a rancher in Colorado who I have considerably more respect for." "Theodore," she said gravely, "wasted." They were both quiet for a while after that, but it was a different quality of quiet than before. Something had shifted, loosened between them, the way a knot loosens when you finally find the right thread to pull. September in the territory was spectacular. The heat began to ease, and the mornings became crisp, and the cottonwoods along the creek turned gold, and the mountains to the east were capped with early snow that glittered in the afternoon light. Helen had grown into the land in a way she had not expected and could not entirely explain. She had thought of the territory as a temporary circumstance, a place she had landed through misfortune, and from which she would eventually return to a normal life in a more manageable geography. But the land had a way of getting inside you, the scale and the silence and the extraordinary light, and she began to suspect that normal and manageable were going to feel terribly cramped once you had breathed this open air. She and Jacob had begun to talk more in the evenings, real conversations rather than the transactional exchanges of the early weeks. She learned about his vision for the homestead, the careful expansion he had planned for the cattle herd, the improvements he wanted to make to the adobe house, the kitchen garden he hoped to expand into a proper kitchen garden, and then a larger growing operation that would allow them to be more self-sufficient through the winter months. He talked about these things with the quiet ardor of a man describing something he loved, and she found herself listening not just with her professional mind, but with something warmer. She told him about Cincinnati in turn, about the dress shop and her father, and the long years of being useful, and the shorter, lonelier years of being dependent on Margaret's charity. She told him about the night she had received his letter, the first telegram from Callaway, and how she had sat in Margaret's spare room with the paper in her hands and felt, for the first time in what seemed like years, the possibility of something other than slow diminishment. Jacob listened to her the way he did everything, carefully and without interruption, and when she finished he was quiet for a moment. "Callaway had a good instinct about people," he said finally. "Whatever else you want to say about him, he could see when someone was worth something." Helen looked at the stars for a moment. "I'd like to think I'm worth something regardless of who noticed," she said. "Of course you are," Jacob said, and there was nothing complicated about how he said it. It was simply stated as a fact, in the same tone he used when he said the creek was reliable, or the south pasture needed another week before it was ready for grazing. And Helen, who had received many compliments in her life and trusted almost none of them, found that this simple, artless statement went through her like light through glass. The Whitmore Fall Gathering was a territory-wide social event held at Whitmore's large ranch house, and while half the people in the valley had complicated feelings about Preston Whitmore personally, the party was attended by nearly everyone because it was the last significant social occasion before the isolation of winter set in, and because Agnes Fowler told Helen firmly that not attending would be interpreted as weakness. Jacob drove them in the wagon. Helen had altered one of her Cincinnati dresses, a dark green wool that was more formal than anything else she owned, and she had put her hair up and worn her mother's remaining brooch. And when she came out to the wagon, Jacob looked at her in the particular way that a person looks at something they have seen before but are seeing properly for the first time. He didn't say anything, just offered his hand to help her up to the wagon seat, but his hand held hers a moment longer than was strictly necessary, and when she settled on the seat beside him and their shoulders were close in the evening air, neither of them shifted apart. The gathering was everything a territory party was supposed to be. Whitmore's house was large and well-furnished and filled with people, ranchers and their families, the doctor, the minister, the schoolteacher, the major landowners from as far as 20 miles out. There was food on long tables and a fiddle player from Cuivo Springs, and dancing on the cleared floor of the main room. Whitmore greeted them at the door and shook Jacob's hand with the careful cordiality of men who dislike each other but are too practical for open hostility. And then he turned to Helen and held her hand longer than a greeting required and told her she looked magnificent, which was exactly the right word and exactly the wrong delivery. Jacob, beside her, said nothing, but she was aware of the stillness in him. Later, when the dancing started, Whitmore asked her for a dance with the smooth confidence of a man accustomed to getting what he asked for. She accepted, because refusing would have made an unnecessary scene, and they danced one polite reel while Whitmore talked about his land and his plans, and casually mentioned the size of his operation in the way that some men mention their wealth, as if it were an argument in itself. She was gracious and pleasant and entirely unreachable, and Whitmore knew it. She could see that he knew it, and something shifted in his expression from charm to assessment. When the dance ended, she found Jacob at the edge of the room near the door to the porch, holding 2 glasses of lemonade with the expression of a man who has been somewhere he did not particularly want to be, but who was not about to leave before the person he came with was ready to leave. He handed her one of the glasses, and they stepped out onto the porch where the night air was cold and clean, and the stars were out in their full territorial glory. "He's not going to stop," Jacob said. He was not talking about the dancing. "I know," Helen said. "He wants the water rights. He thinks if he can convince you to leave, or if he can convince you that a better situation is available elsewhere, it undermines what I've built here." Helen looked at him. "He can't convince me of something that isn't true," she said. Jacob turned to look at her, and the light from the windows behind them caught his face in a way that made him look very young and very earnest and very much like a man who had something to say that he had been composing for some time. "Helen," he said. And then he stopped. She waited. "I want to say something to you," he said carefully, "and I don't want you to think I'm saying it because of Whitmore or because of the arrangement or because of anything except that it's true." "Then say it," she said softly. He looked at her for a moment longer with those steady gray eyes. "I think about you," he said, "through the day and at night and in the morning before I'm even properly awake. I think about what you'll say when I tell you something and what you'll think and whether it will make you smile." He stopped and looked down at his glass for a moment. "I've never been a man who talks more than he means, so I want you to know I mean every word." Helen felt the cold air on her face and the warmth in her chest and the stars overhead and the fiddle music through the door, and she thought about Cincinnati and the telegram and the long train ride, and the moment she had stepped off, and the world had seemed to contract into a single point of uncertainty. And then she thought about the morning she had looked at Jacob across the breakfast table and felt, in the simplest and most irreducible way, that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. "I think about you too," she said, "quite a lot actually." The expression that crossed his face was one she had not seen before and would spend a long time after thinking about. A kind of quiet, helpless happiness, as if something he had not dared expect had simply appeared in front of him. He reached over and took her free hand in his, carefully, the way you take something you know is precious. And they stood on Preston Whitmore's porch under the stars of the territory, and neither of them said anything else for a while, because there was nothing that needed to be said that wasn't already perfectly clear. They drove home late, with a blanket across both their laps against the cold, and the horses knew the way well enough that Jacob didn't need to concentrate overly hard on the road. And Helen sat beside him in the dark with her shoulder warm against his and watched the stars and felt something she recognized, after a moment, as happiness. Not the anxious, provisional kind she had been making do with for years, but the real thing, wide and clean and certain. Winter came to the territory with a serious intent. The first real snow fell in November, a thick overnight blanket that turned the world white and made the mountains disappear into cloud, and transformed the familiar landscape into something extraordinary and hushed. Helen stood at the kitchen window in the early morning and watched the snow and thought about Robert Calloway, who had never seen this particular morning and never would, and felt the complicated weight of the fact that one man's ending had made possible a beginning she could not have imagined from the distance of Cincinnati. She had written to Robert Calloway's family in Missouri, a careful letter acknowledging his invitation and expressing her condolences, and she had received in return a brief note from his sister saying that Robert had mentioned her specifically, that he had said she was exactly the kind of capable woman the territory needed, and that his sister hoped she had found good footing. Helen had read that letter twice and then put it in the same box where she kept the two telegrams, the invitation and the news of his death. And she kept those papers together because they were part of the same story, the story of how she had come here. She and Jacob had been moving toward each other with the careful inevitability of two people who were both constitutionally cautious, but who also, in the deeper part of themselves, knew what they wanted. There had been more evenings on the porch, longer conversations, the small and accumulating tenderness of daily proximity. There had been a morning when she had been reaching for the highest shelf in the kitchen, and he had come in and reached it for her without being asked, and his arm had brushed hers, and neither of them had moved away. There had been an afternoon when she had been struggling with a particularly obstinate section of the fence surrounding the kitchen garden, and he had crouched down beside her to help, and they had worked together in a silence that was so full of warmth it was almost audible. On a December evening, with the snow deep outside and the fire burning high in the main room, and the Vega brothers settled in the bunkhouse, and the world contracted to the warm circle of lamplight, and the sound of the wood settling in the grate, Jacob sat across from her at the table and set down the book he had been reading and looked at her. "I'd like to ask you something," he said. She set down her own book. She could feel the weight of what was coming, the good weight of it, like the moment before a long rain when the air is full and ready. "There's a minister in Redemption," he said, "Reverend Alcott. He's been here since the town was founded, and he's a decent man." He paused. "I'd like him to marry us if you're willing." Helen looked at him for a long moment. The fire crackled. Outside, the wind moved through the snow. "Jacob," she said. "Yes." He let out a breath, and for a moment he looked so thoroughly relieved that she nearly laughed. "I wasn't sure," he said. "I'm not always good at reading what people—" "Yes," she said again, more warmly this time, and reached across the table and took his hand, and his fingers closed around hers immediately, as if they had been waiting for exactly that. They were married in January of 1883, on a clear, cold Saturday morning when the sky was that particular blue that only exists in the desert in winter, a blue so deep and saturated it looked painted. Reverend Alcott performed the ceremony in the small church on Redemption's Main Street, with Agnes Fowler and her husband standing as witnesses, and the Vega brothers in the front pew in their best clothes looking simultaneously delighted and slightly overwhelmed by the emotion of the occasion. Deputy Marsh attended and removed his hat throughout, and looked quietly pleased with the way things had turned out. Helen wore her green wool dress again, with her mother's silver brooch at the collar, and she carried a small bunch of dried wildflowers that Diego Vega had saved from the previous summer's bloom, and presented to her that morning with a solemnity that had nearly made her cry. Jacob wore his good shirt and a jacket she had not seen before, dark and well-made, and when he turned to watch her walk down the short aisle of the church, he looked at her the way he had looked at her on Preston Whitmore's porch, with that quiet and helpless happiness that was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen on a human face. Reverend Alcott read the traditional vows, and Jacob said his with the steady, absolute conviction that was so entirely him, each word landing with the weight of something meant forever. And Helen said hers with a clarity and certainty that she felt in her bones. And when Alcott said they were married, Jacob kissed her, properly but briefly, and Agnes Fowler made a sound that was definitively a sob quickly converted to a cough. And Arturo Vega said something in Spanish that his brother Diego immediately shushed him about. Agnes hosted the wedding supper at the general store, which she had closed for the afternoon and decorated with what she had, some pine boughs and candles, and a lace tablecloth that she had brought from Virginia when she came west 20 years ago. She had made a roast and 3 kinds of bread and a dried apple cake that was the best thing Helen had eaten since leaving Cincinnati, and the gathered company ate and drank and talked through the long winter afternoon while outside the sun moved across the blue desert sky, and the mountains stood clear and white on the horizon. Preston Whitmore did not attend, which surprised no one, and sent no word, which also surprised no one. Their first winter as a married couple was the kind of winter that builds something between two people that no other season can. The territory in winter demanded a particular closeness, the days short and cold, the world contracted to the warm radius of what you had built, the work constant and shared. Jacob and Helen settled into the daily life of the homestead with the ease of 2 people who had been training for exactly this without knowing it. Their rhythms compatible in the deep way that has nothing to do with compatibility in the abstract, and everything to do with the specific texture of how 2 people exist in the same space. She kept the accounts and the household and the supply arrangements, and he kept the cattle and the land and the endless practical business of maintaining a working operation through the cold months. In the evenings, they read and talked and sat together by the fire, and Jacob turned out, in the privacy of a shared life, to be funnier than he appeared, with a dry and precise humor that came out in flashes and always caught her slightly off guard. He was also, she discovered, an extraordinarily patient man in most respects, but possessed of a stubborn streak on certain subjects, principally the correct way to repair a saddle and the question of whether the south pasture was ready for early spring grazing, about which he and Diego Vega had what appeared to be a running debate that had been going on for at least 3 years. In February, Whitmore made his move on the water rights. It came in the form of a legal filing, delivered to Jacob by Deputy Marsh with a face that said he personally found the entire business offensive, asserting that a portion of the creek's course ran through what Whitmore claimed was his land, and that therefore Jacob's use of the water for his cattle operation was in violation of the original land grant terms. It was, as Jacob explained to Helen that evening with a controlled anger that was more frightening than shouting would have been, largely fabricated, but fabricated with enough legal complexity that it would require time and money to fight. Helen read through the filing carefully. She had kept her father's accounts and dealt with his creditors after his death, and she had in the process become familiar with the way paperwork was used as a weapon. She sat at the table with the document spread before her and her pen in her hand and went through it line by line and made notes. "Here," she said, an hour later, pointing to a specific section. "The original land grant boundaries he's citing are from an 1869 survey. But there was a resurvey done in 1875 that I saw referenced in the county records when I was organizing the homestead papers. If the 1875 survey supersedes the 1869 one, which it should as the more recent official measurement, his entire claim about the creek's course is based on the wrong starting point." Jacob came around the table and looked over her shoulder at the documents. She was acutely aware of him behind her, his breath warm near her hair, his hand resting on the back of her chair. "You're right," he said slowly. "I knew about that resurvey, but I didn't make the connection." He paused. "There's a lawyer in Las Vegas who handles territorial land cases, a man named Delgado. I need to get these documents to him." "Write the letter tonight," Helen said. "I'll make a copy of all the relevant pages while you do." They worked together until late, Jacob writing to the lawyer and Helen carefully copying the county records she had organized and indexed during her first months on the homestead. When they finished, she made coffee and they sat together at the cleared table, and Jacob looked at her with an expression she had come to recognize as the one he wore when something had moved him and he was trying to be quiet about it. "I couldn't have found that on my own," he said. "I want you to know that." "You knew the survey existed," she said. "Knowing something exists and knowing what to do with it are different things." He was quiet for a moment. "Calloway said you were capable. He didn't quite do you justice." Helen felt warmth flood through her. "He did well enough," she said. "He got me here." The legal matter wound through the territorial system for several months. Lawyer Delgado in Las Vegas proved to be exactly what was needed, a meticulous and determined man who enjoyed nothing more than a well-documented argument, and the 1875 resurvey proved to be as decisive as Helen had suspected. By April, Whitmore's claim was formally rejected by the territorial court, a ruling that was documented and registered and sent to Jacob with a covering letter from Delgado that said, in the measured language of legal correspondence, that the case had been unusually clear-cut once the relevant survey documents were properly presented. Jacob read the letter at the breakfast table and then looked up at Helen across his coffee. "It's done," he said simply. Helen smiled. "Good." "Delgado says Whitmore may try again with a different angle," Jacob said, "but the water rights are established. He'd need a very different argument to get any traction." "Let him try," Helen said. "I've organized every document in this household going back to the original land grant. He's welcome to take us to court again." Jacob looked at her over the table with that helpless happiness again, and the morning light was coming through the kitchen window and falling across the table between them, and she thought, "I am not going back. There is nothing to go back to." And it was the most liberating thought she had ever had. Spring came to the territory in March, tentative at first and then all at once, the way spring comes in dramatic country. The snow melted off the mountains and ran down into the creek and turned it briefly high and fast and cold, and the sage bloomed silver-green on the hillsides, and the cattle which had been thinned through the hard months began to fill out on the fresh grass, and the kitchen garden came to life under Helen's hands with a thoroughness that delighted her. She had planted it properly in the fall, turning in compost and organizing the beds by what would grow well in the territory's particular combination of heat and altitude and arid air. And now the results were visible in the neat rows of coming green, and she spent time there every morning that the weather allowed, and found it one of the most satisfying occupations she had ever had, this conversion of bare earth and seed into food. One morning in late March, she was in the garden when Jacob came to find her, which was unusual because normally she knew where he was at all hours and he knew where she was, the natural mapping of shared territory. She straightened and shaded her eyes and he came across the yard with something in his hand, a letter. "It's from Clara," he said, "his sister in Santa Fe. She's asking if she and her husband can come for a visit in May." Helen took the letter and read it. Clara Hartwell had married Thomas Reyes, a lawyer born in New Mexico to a family with deep roots in the territory, and from Jacob's descriptions of her, she was a woman of considerable intelligence and warmth and opinions. Helen had been looking forward to meeting her. "Tell her yes," she said immediately. "I'd love to have her." Jacob was watching her with the particular quality of attention she had noticed he gave to things he found important. "I was hoping you'd say that," he said. "Were you worried I wouldn't?" "No," he said. "Not exactly worried, just hoping." He reached out and tucked a strand of hair back from her face, a gesture that still made her breath catch slightly because it was so gentle, and then he turned and went back to the day's work. She stood in the garden for a moment after he had gone, her hands in the fresh earth and the spring air around her, and the mountains white against the enormous sky, and she felt the completeness of it so precisely that she had to hold very still to contain it. Clara Reyes arrived in May with her husband Thomas and enough energy to power a small town. She was 5 years younger than Jacob, 25 to his 30, with his same dark hair and steady gray eyes, but a personality that was all forward motion and enthusiastic opinion, where his was considered and contained. She embraced Helen within approximately 4 minutes of arriving, before they had finished the introductions, and said directly into her ear, "He wrote me about you. He said you were the most competent and interesting person he had ever met. I think that was his way of saying he was in love with you before he quite knew it himself." Helen laughed, genuinely and freely, and decided on the spot that she was going to love Clara Reyes. Thomas Reyes was a quiet, thoughtful man who shared his wife's enthusiasm if not her volume, and he and Jacob spent long evenings talking about the territory and its future with the absorption of two men who had both chosen this land as their own and cared deeply about what it became. Helen and Clara talked too, and Clara asked her directly about Cincinnati and about Robert Calloway and about how it had felt to arrive in the territory as she had, on a dead man's invitation. "It was terrifying," Helen said honestly. "And also, in some way I can't entirely explain, it felt right. Like something I had been moving toward without knowing it." Clara looked at her with her brother's eyes but her own expression. "Jacob told me something once years ago," she said. "He said the territory teaches you what you're made of, and what you find out usually surprises you." She paused. "I think it surprised both of you." "I think it did," Helen agreed. The visit lasted 2 weeks and ended with a standing invitation to come to Santa Fe, which Helen accepted immediately, and with Clara extracting a promise that Helen would write regularly, which she did. In early June, Helen realized she was pregnant. She told Jacob on a Tuesday morning, in the kitchen, over coffee, because she was not a woman who made ceremonies out of things that could be said plainly. She simply looked at him and said, "I believe we are going to have a child." Jacob set down his coffee cup. He was still for a moment in the way he was still when he was processing something that mattered. Then he looked up at her, and the expression on his face was something she had not seen before, a layered and complex thing that was joy and awe and a kind of solemn responsibility all at once. He stood up and came around the table and took her face in his hands carefully, and kissed her forehead and then held her, properly and close, his arms warm around her, and she leaned into him and thought about how far she had come from the woman who had stood on that train platform in Dodge City with a crumpled telegram and nothing but determination. "Are you all right?" he said against her hair. "I am very well," she said. "Better than I have been in years." The pregnancy was, on the whole, an uneventful one. The town doctor, a gruff but competent man named Dr. Farrow, who had come west from Philadelphia 10 years ago and never gone back, pronounced her healthy and the baby well-positioned, and Agnes Fowler appointed herself a kind of unofficial advisor on the subject, and arrived periodically with food and opinions in roughly equal proportions. The summer passed in a golden haze of work and heat, and the particular contentment of a life that was full in every direction. The cattle herd had grown through careful management and a good spring. The kitchen garden was producing more than they could eat, and they had begun to put up preserved goods against the winter with a thoroughness that Helen found deeply satisfying. Jacob had started the improvements to the house, adding a room onto the east side that would begin as a nursery and eventually become whatever it needed to become, building with his own hands and the help of the Vega brothers, working in the long summer evenings after the day's ranch work was done. Helen watched him from the porch sometimes, working in the late light with his sleeves rolled up and his face intent, and she thought about the woman she had been in Cincinnati, careful and contained and slowly contracting, and she thought about what this country and this man had made possible, and she felt a gratitude so large it had nowhere to go except outward, into the wide desert air. In September, Whitmore made one final attempt to complicate their lives, this time not through legal channels, but through a more direct and unpleasant method. He sent 2 of his ranch hands to intercept Jacob on the road back from Cuervo Springs, with the apparent intention of delivering a message about the wisdom of being more cooperative on the water rights question. Jacob arrived home that evening with a bruised jaw and a controlled fury that was more frightening than any amount of shouting would have been. Helen sat across from him at the kitchen table and cleaned the cut on his jaw with careful hands and listened to what had happened. "Did you know them?" she asked. "Whitmore's men, both of them," he said, "Dunn and a man called Paris. And the message? That I should consider settling the water rights question outside the courts," Jacob said. "That there are ways to make life difficult for a homestead that depend on good relations with the larger operations in the valley." Helen put down the cloth and looked at him steadily. "We need to go to the sheriff," she said. "Marsh is a deputy," Jacob said. "The sheriff is in Cuervo Springs and he and Whitmore have a long acquaintance." "Then we write to the territorial marshal," Helen said. "We document what happened tonight with your injuries as evidence, and we write a full account of every action Whitmore has taken against this homestead, including the fraudulent legal claim and tonight's intimidation, and we send it to Santa Fe." She paused. "Thomas Reyes is a lawyer who cares about the rule of law in this territory. Clara told me so explicitly. I think he would know exactly who to address." Jacob was quiet for a moment. Outside the crickets were going and the moon was rising over the eastern mountains. "You're right," he said. "You're completely right." "I generally am," she said, with just enough warmth in it that he almost smiled despite his jaw. She wrote the letter that night, methodical and precise, laying out the complete history of Whitmore's actions in a language that was factual and devastating in its accuracy. Jacob reviewed it and added what she had missed, and they sent it by the fastest available route to Thomas Reyes in Santa Fe. Thomas Reyes, it turned out, did indeed know exactly who to address. By October, there was a territorial marshal's investigation underway into Preston Whitmore's methods of land acquisition, and within that investigation, the incident on the road and the fraudulent legal claim were both documented. Whitmore did not go to prison. The law in 1883 New Mexico Territory was not so certain a thing as that, but he was formally censured and placed under official scrutiny, and the practical effect was that he began to pull back from his more aggressive expansions, and the valley around Redemption breathed a collective quiet sigh of relief that everyone understood and no one said out loud. He sold Theodore the horse a few months later. Jacob, learning of this, bought the animal himself at a fair price and brought him home one afternoon in early winter to a stable beside the creek, and Helen went out to meet them and fed Theodore a piece of apple from her hand and told him he had come to a better situation, and Jacob stood beside her and watched the horse and smiled. Their son was born in late February of 1884, during a night when the stars were so brilliant and close they seemed nearly within reach, and he arrived with a forcefulness of opinion that suggested he would be his mother's child as much as his father's. Dr. Farrow attended and Agnes Fowler was there, unavoidably and by her own insistence, and the birth was hard in the way that births always are, but it went well, And when Dr. Farrow put the baby in Jacob's arms, Jacob looked at his son with an expression that Helen, watching from the pillow, felt would stay with her for the rest of her life. They named him Robert James Hartwell, Robert for the man whose invitation had made everything possible. James for Jacob's father, who had died when Jacob was 12, and who he still spoke of with the careful tenderness of someone who has known loss young. Jacob sat on the edge of the bed and held Robert and looked at Helen, and she looked back at him, both of them exhausted and quiet and full. "Thank you," he said. It was not the most articulate thing he had ever said, but he meant it with every syllable, and she knew it. "Thank you," she said back. Robert James Hartwell turned out to be a child of enormous curiosity and considerable volume, who from the first week seemed to regard the world as something personally addressed to him and requiring immediate investigation. He had his father's gray eyes and his mother's stubborn jaw, and a disposition that was entirely his own, cheerful and energetic and completely certain of his own significance. He grew in the territory as Helen had grown, with a kind of deep belonging that had nothing to do with where you came from and everything to do with where you planted yourself. He went everywhere with his parents, in a carrier on Helen's back when he was small, and then toddling after them through the garden and the yard, and eventually, on a small horse named Chester, across the fields beside his father. Clara and Thomas Rays came for an extended visit in the summer of 1884 and held Robert with the carefulness of people who had not yet had children of their own but intended to, and Clara looked at Helen over the baby's head with the expression of a woman who knows she is witnessing something good. "He looks like Jacob," Clara said. "He argues like me," Helen said. "Heaven help the territory," Clara said and laughed. In the spring of 1885, Helen discovered she was pregnant again. She told Jacob over breakfast again, in the same kitchen, in the same plain way, and he did the same thing he had done the first time, came around the table and held her, and she thought, "This is who we are now, this is the whole of it, this beautiful, ordinary, extraordinary life." Their second child, a daughter they named Clara Margaret, after both her aunt and after Helen's cousin in Cincinnati who had, despite her charity being somewhat exhausting, kept Helen housed and fed in her darkest year, arrived in December of 1885 with considerably less drama than Robert had, and an immediate air of serene self-possession that seemed to belong equally to both her parents. Redemption had grown in those years. There were new buildings on the main street. A small school had been established with a teacher brought from Santa Fe. The church had been expanded, and a new family named Ortega had opened a restaurant that made the sort of red chili stew that became, within its first season, what everyone in the valley considered the definitive version of the dish. The territory itself was changing around them, the railroad pushing further in, the population growing, the long wild openness of the earlier years beginning to compress and formalize. Not all of these changes were uncomplicated. The land that had belonged to Apache and Navajo peoples for generations continued to be absorbed by the encroaching settlement, and the injustices of that process were visible to anyone who was paying attention. Jacob and Helen were paying attention. They had among their neighbors several Mexican families whose land grants from the Spanish and Mexican periods were being challenged by Anglo settlers who understood the American legal system better than those families did, and Helen, who understood ledgers and documents and the power of organized paperwork, spent considerable hours helping Maria Vasquez and her sister Lucia compile and present the documentation of their family's land claim in a way that the territorial courts could not dismiss easily. Not every battle was won. Some were, and in the ones that weren't, there was at least the evidence of people who had shown up and tried. Jacob had a long conversation with her one evening about the Apache families who had lived in the mountain country east of the homestead and who were now largely confined to the reservation, and his voice when he spoke of it had the same controlled anger it had when he spoke of Whitmore, the specific fury of a man who understands that something wrong is happening and is trying to locate within himself what, within his limited individual power, he can actually do about it. "We can't fix it," he said. "I know that, but we can refuse to benefit from it whenever that's in our control, and we can make sure our children understand what it cost." Helen agreed with him completely, and they talked about it with Robert when he was old enough to understand, and with Clara Margaret after him, and both children grew up with a knowledge of the territory's full history, the beauty and the violence and the complexity and the cost, that their parents considered more valuable than any amount of simpler comfort. Robert was 6 years old in 1890, and Clara Margaret was 4 when Helen told Jacob there would be a third child. He was standing in the kitchen garden at the time, helping her tie up the climbing beans, and he stopped and looked at her with a slow smile that was so warm and unhurried it felt like the sun coming out. "3," he said. "3," she confirmed. "The house has room," he said. This was his way of expressing several things at once: contentment, welcome, the ongoing expansion of what they were building together. Their third child was a second son, born in the late summer of 1890, and they named him Thomas William, Thomas for Clara's husband who had become one of Jacob's closest friends over the years, William for no particular reason except that it seemed to suit the baby, who arrived with a deliberate and unhurried quality that was evident from the first hour and never changed. Thomas William Hartwell grew up to be the quietest of the 3 children, thoughtful in the way his father was thoughtful, observant and steady, and very funny when he chose to be, which was not often enough for his siblings' satisfaction. By the early 1890s, the homestead had evolved into something substantial. The cattle operation had expanded carefully, Jacob having always preferred depth over breadth, quality over quantity, and the herd was known in the valley and beyond for its health and the consistency of its output. The house had been added to twice. The kitchen garden was a proper kitchen garden and then some, and the land around the creek was as productive and well-tended as anything in the territory. Helen had taken on, over the years, a role that went beyond the domestic and into the community in ways she had not anticipated, but that seemed entirely natural in retrospect. She kept accounts for several families in Redemption who had no one else to do it for them. She taught reading to the children of the Vega brothers, who had both married in the late 1880s and whose families now lived in a small cluster of houses at the edge of the Hartwell property, a domestic geography that suited everyone. She maintained a correspondence with Clara Reyes in Santa Fe that had become one of the organizing threads of her inner life. 2 women writing to each other, with the frankness and affection of people who had dispensed long ago, with the need to present any version of themselves other than the true one. Agnes Fowler retired from the general store in 1891, and her nephew took it over, and Agnes came to the Hartwell homestead one afternoon in the autumn to tell them, and to drink tea, and to look around with the satisfaction of a woman who had seen a lot of stories in her time and knew when she was in the presence of a good one. "When you walked into my store that first day," Agnes said to Helen, "I thought, here is a woman who is going to land on her feet or not land at all because she is not going to land anywhere in between." Helen laughed. "I'm not sure that's entirely a compliment." "It absolutely is," Agnes said. "The women who can land in between are comfortable, but they generally don't build anything." Jacob, who had come in from the yard in time to hear this, said nothing, but refilled everyone's tea cups with the attentive courtesy that was so characteristic of him, and met Helen's eyes over the table with a small, private smile. Robert was 12, and Clara Margaret was 10, and Thomas was 2 in 1892, when Jacob's sister Clara and her husband Thomas Reyes moved from Santa Fe to Las Vegas, New Mexico, considerably closer than before, and the visits between the 2 families became more frequent, and the cousins who had arrived in the Reyes household, 2 of them by now with a third arriving that spring, became a regular feature of the Hartwell children's lives. Robert had Jacob's steadiness and Helen's precision, and was going to be, Everyone who knew him agreed, a particularly formidable combination of both. He had decided at age 10 that he wanted to understand the law in the territory, specifically the land law, because he had watched enough of his mother's careful documentation work to understand that the law was a tool and tools could be used well or badly, and he intended to use them well. Jacob and Helen regarded this ambition with pride and a certain quiet satisfaction at the idea that what they had started might continue in a different form. Clara Margaret had inherited her Aunt Clara's gift for forward motion and enthusiastic opinion, and was by age 10 already the dominant personality in any room she entered, a quality that her father regarded with a mixture of pride and gentle amusement, and that her mother regarded with pure recognition. She was going to be fine. Her mother had no doubt. She was going to be considerably more than fine. Thomas William watched his siblings and the world with those steady Hartwell eyes and grew at his own pace and in his own direction. And when he was 4 years old, he climbed up onto the fence beside the paddock where Theodore, who was aging now but still magnificent, lived out his comfortable retirement. And he sat there for an hour watching the horse with a concentration that his father recognized as the beginning of something. On a September evening in 1893, 11 years after Helen Winslow had stepped off a train in Dodge City with a crumpled telegram and nothing but nerve, she and Jacob sat on the porch of their house and watched the sun go down behind the mountains to the west. The air was cool and smelled of sage, and the wood smoke coming from the cookhouse where Esperanza Vega, Diego's wife, was finishing the evening meal. From inside the house came the sounds of their 3 children at various elevations of activity, Robert's quiet voice reading to Thomas, Clara Margaret's louder voice conducting what sounded like a negotiation about something, and then a burst of laughter from all 3 of them at once. Jacob had his arm around Helen's shoulders and she had her head resting against him, and the cottonwoods along the creek were going gold in the last light, and the mountains were turning purple and then blue, and the first stars were appearing in the east. "I want to show you something," Jacob said. He reached into his shirt pocket and produced a folded piece of paper, which he handed to her. She opened it. It was a letter from the Territorial Land Office, confirming the formal registration of the Hartwell Creek water rights in perpetuity, a process that Jacob had been working through for the better part of a year, with the help of Thomas Rays and the thorough documentation that Helen had been building since her first days on the homestead. "It's done," he said, "completely, formally, legally done. No one can touch it now. Not Whitmore, not whoever comes after Whitmore, not anyone." Helen looked at the paper for a long moment. The water that ran along the edge of their land, the water that the cattle drank and the garden depended on, and the children played in, and that had been the source of so much contention and trouble in the early years, was theirs, documented and registered and permanent. She folded the paper carefully and gave it back to him. "Put that in the strongbox with the land grant," she said. "Already planning to," he said. She leaned back against him and looked at the stars coming out. Inside, the laughter had settled to the quiet voices of bedtime, and they would need to go in soon, but not yet. Not quite yet. "Do you remember what you said to me," she said, "that night on Whitmore's porch? The first thing you ever really said to me." "I said I thought about you," Jacob said. His voice was exactly the same as it had always been, low and even and carrying every word with full weight. "You did," she said. "Still true," he said. "More so." She looked up at him in the last light, at the face she had been watching and learning for 11 years, the face that was as familiar to her now as her own and as interesting, because it was the face of a man who kept revealing new things not through drama or surprise, but through the quiet accumulation of a lifetime of being who he was. "I came here for a job," she said. "On a dead man's invitation, with exactly $12 in my coat pocket and 1 silver brooch left of my mother's." "I know," he said. "And now look," she said softly, not with triumphalism, just with wonder. He pulled her a little closer, and they sat together in the cooling evening and watched the mountains go dark and the stars come fully out, the great canopy of the territory night that never failed to make her feel both small and exactly the right size simultaneously. From inside the house, Thomas William called for his mother, the way 2-year-olds call, with absolute confidence that the call will be answered. And Helen smiled and stood, and Jacob stood with her, and they went inside together to the warmth and noise and full complexity of the life they had made. Over the following years, the homestead became, gradually, and without anyone deciding that this is what it was becoming, a kind of center of gravity for the people around it. The Vega families were there, and the Ortega family from town had taken to stopping by on Sunday afternoons because Esperanza and Rosa Ortega were old friends, and Deputy Marsh, who had retired and whose wife had died and who was somewhat at loose ends in his old age, came out regularly for supper on Fridays and played cards with Jacob and drank coffee and said very little and was visibly the better for being somewhere that felt like family. Robert went to study law in Santa Fe at 17, living with his Aunt Clara and Uncle Thomas, who were not technically his aunt and uncle, but who occupied that territory so thoroughly that the distinction had long since dissolved. He wrote to his parents regularly and at length, his letters dense with observations about the law and the territory's political situation and the changes that were coming, and his mother wrote back letters that were longer and sharper, and that he read multiple times and kept. Clara Margaret, at 14, was already helping Helen with the community account work and the documentation assistance for families in the valley, and had announced with the absolute certainty she brought to everything that she intended to become the first woman lawyer in New Mexico Territory, which in 1896 was not yet possible, but which Helen and Jacob both, separately and together, believed she would eventually find a way to make happen regardless. Thomas William, quiet and steady, stayed close to the land. He was a natural with horses in the way that some people simply are, and Jacob taught him everything he knew and then watched him exceed it. And the understanding between father and son on the subject of horses and cattle and the specific language of working land was one of the quiet pleasures of Jacob's later years, a transmission of knowledge and love of place from one generation to the next. In 1897, Robert graduated and came home for the summer before establishing his practice in Las Vegas, and the 3 children were together under the homestead roof for the last extended time before the full divergence of adult lives took them to their various places in the world. Jacob and Helen watched their children together on those summer evenings on the porch. The way Robert and Clara Margaret argued about territorial politics with the specific passion of 2 people who had been raised to believe the arguments mattered. The way Thomas sat on the fence with whatever current horse was his project and watched the hills. And the air was warm, and the stars were coming, and everything was whole. Helen found Jacob in the barn one evening during that summer, a late evening when the children were inside and the day's work was done, and he was checking on an older mare who had been unwell, moving around the stall with the quiet competence he brought to everything. She leaned on the stall door and watched him, and he looked up and saw her, and his face did the thing it had always done when he looked at her, even now after 15 years, that quiet and unhelpless happiness. "She's better," he said. "Whatever Pharaoh gave her for the cough seems to have worked." "Good," Helen said. He came and leaned on the stall door beside her, their arms touching, and they looked at the mare in the lamplight. "I was thinking today," Helen said, "about the day I arrived, the depot in Dodge City." "I know," he said. He often knew what she was thinking, not through any mysticism, but through 15 years of paying close attention to the person beside him. "I was so certain that the only way out was through," she said, "that I had to get to redemption because there was nothing left behind me and no other direction but forward." "There wasn't," he agreed. "No," she said. "There wasn't." She paused. "And here is what's forward." Jacob put his arm around her there in the barn with the lamp burning low and the mare settling in her stall, and he held her in the way that he had held her for 15 years, as if she were both necessary and precious, as if letting go were simply not a thing he intended to do. "Here is what's forward," he agreed. The territory of New Mexico became the state of New Mexico in January of 1912, a moment that the people of Redemption and the surrounding valley marked with a celebration that lasted 3 days, and that Agnes Fowler, who was 80 years old and somewhat reduced from her earlier magnificence, but still fully in possession of her opinions, declared was entirely adequate. By then, Robert Hartwell was a lawyer of 30 years, with a reputation across the state for his work on land rights, and his particular attention to cases involving Mexican land grant families, whose claims had been improperly absorbed by the American legal system. He had married a woman named Elena Castillo from a family in Las Vegas, whose history in the territory went back 200 years, and they had 2 children and a house full of books, and a great deal of organized determination about the state of the law in New Mexico. Clara Margaret Hartwell had, as her mother had entirely expected, found a way to make the impossible possible. She had read law under her brother's supervision and had passed the territorial bar examination in 1908, the second woman to do so, and she practiced with a particular focus on the rights of women and of families dispossessed by the legal machinery of land consolidation. She was not yet married, and had indicated that she was not in any hurry, which her father accepted without comment, and her mother accepted with complete understanding. Thomas William Hartwell ran the homestead, which had become by then a proper cattle operation of some regional note, and he had married a woman named Guadalupe Morno in 1909, and they had a son born in 1910, who they named Jacob Robert, for both grandfathers, and who arrived in the world with a decisiveness that suggested he had places to be and things to do, and was not going to wait around about it. Jacob Hartwell held his grandson on the day of the statehood celebration, and looked at the baby with the expression that Helen knew went all the way to the bottom of him, that layered and complex thing that was joy and awe and solemn responsibility, the same expression she had first seen the day she told him they were going to have a child, 30 years ago now, in a different world that was also the same world. Helen stood beside him on the porch, the old porch of the old house that had been added to and modified and repaired, and added to again over the decades, until it was a different building entirely, while also being completely the same building, and watched her husband hold their grandson, and felt the whole weight and richness of the time between. The cottonwoods along the creek were bare in January, but the water ran clear and cold, and the mountains to the east were white with new snow, and the sky was the particular winter blue that she had first seen 30 years ago, and had never stopped finding extraordinary. Jacob looked up at her over the baby's head, and the eyes that met hers were the same steady gray they had always been, perhaps with more lines at the corners now, and perhaps with more knowledge in them, but the same essential quality, the quality she had recognized that first afternoon in the Redemption General Store when he had come through the door and looked at her directly and without calculation, the quality she had trusted before she had any logical reason to, the quality that had turned out, over 30 years, to be entirely trustworthy. She took the baby from him for a moment, and Jacob's arm came around her shoulders with the automatic ease of long habit and deep choice, and they stood together on the porch of the home they had built, in the state of New Mexico, on a January morning in 1912, while their children and grandchildren moved through the house behind them, and the creek ran on, and the mountains stood white, and the sky was infinite and blue and deeply, permanently theirs. "I still think about you," Jacob said. His voice was exactly the same as it had always been, all the time. Helen leaned against him, the baby warm in her arms, the cold air on her face. "I know," she said. "I know you do." The mountains caught the morning sun and turned gold for a moment, the way they did, the brief transformation before settling back into their usual blue. Little Jacob Robert made a sound of tremendous personal importance, and moved his small hands as if he were conducting the whole enterprise. The house and the land and the creek and the sky and the two people standing on the porch who had between them made everything he would ever know as home. "Robert Calloway," Helen said softly, into the cold air. Jacob made a small sound of understanding. "He would have liked this," she said. "He would have taken credit for all of it," Jacob said, with the dry warmth he had always reserved for the memory of his old friend. Helen laughed quietly, and the sound of it went out into the January morning and was carried away on the cold, clear air of New Mexico. And the mountains held steady on the horizon, and the creek ran on, and the story that had begun with a telegram and a dead man's invitation, and a woman with $12 and a silver brooch and more courage than she quite knew she had, settled into its permanent and happy shape, complete and whole and fully at rest.